Okay, we're gonna give this a go. The last video I did, I had a lot of sirens. So hopefully I've relocated where we're not gonna have too much of a problem with wind or sirens, okay? So we're covering GWF Hegel and his way of understanding death in terms of human consciousness, okay? And Hegel is a philosopher, probably one of the most important philosophers of the 19th century. He was born in 1770 and died in 1831. And interestingly enough, he actually died during a cholera epidemic that was taking place in Europe at the time. He was at the height of his career. The book that we're getting our excerpt out of is titled The Phenomenology of Spirit, and that was written in 1807. And so see the phenomenology of spirit as development of human consciousness, okay? So not only is this a development of human consciousness in terms of the self, okay, it's more thought of as a development of human consciousness in terms of the greater whole. As a matter of fact, the whole of human spirit. Okay, so the whole of human spirit at any given time for Hegel is otherwise known as Geist. Okay, so we are all working in relation to each other. All the ways in which we are conscious with each other is an actualization of Geist for Hegel, okay, at any given time in history. So he was a philosopher of history as well as a philosopher of reason, and also a way of thinking about the spirit in terms of trying to get it to where we're working from how it is that we're understanding ourselves, in other words, being in itself versus being for itself. So being for itself for Hegel is otherwise known as self-consciousness or even self-actualization, okay? And so self-actualization is a way in which we understand the progression of human freedom, and likewise the progression of human consciousness, okay? So human consciousness, this is the story of the progression of human consciousness as it's understood philosophically for GWF Hegel, okay? So I'm gonna read you this portion here. Hopefully I could read it clearly enough to have you read along, because I'll have an excerpt for you on D2L. Okay, so death, if that is what we want to call this non-actuality, is of all things the most dreadful, and to hold fast what is dead requires the greatest strength. Lacking strength, beauty hates the understanding for asking of her what it cannot do. But the life of spirit is not the life that shrinks from death and keeps itself untouched by devastation, but rather the life that endures it and maintains itself in it. It wins its truth only when, in utter dismemberment, it finds itself. It is this power, not as something positive, which closes its eyes to the negative, as when we say of something that is nothing or is false, and then, having done with it, turns away and passes on to something else. On the contrary, spirit is the power only by looking the negative in the face and tarrying with it. This tarrying with the negative is the magical power that converts it into being. Okay, so we're keen in on a couple of things. One, the negative, and two, death. And obviously the way in which consciousness becomes actualized by way of transcending death, okay? So in Hegel, you have the dialectic, which is way that we're understanding working with the negative as a means of transcendence. So, in other words, when we are confronted with the negative, that which is counter to being, otherwise known as death, our consciousness seeks to supersede that by way of a sublation. So death is a contradiction to life, okay? And this contradiction to life is a way in which consciousness understands itself as working to self-actualization, okay? So, in other words, self-actualization for the human being, for Hegel, is brought about by work, interestingly enough. So the way that we understand human labor by way of working through the actual physical matter of by way of working through physical matter itself, by way of physical labor and intellectual labor, we then see that that is an expression of consciousness. So, in other words, work itself is an expression of consciousness, and that expression of consciousness is a way of becoming self-actualized by way of desire to become recognized by the other, or another self-consciousness, okay? Or even another consciousness. So with Hegel, we have self-consciousness, which is a full realization of consciousness for the human being, not only for oneself, but in terms of a whole community. So in other words, a whole community can have self-consciousness as well by way of working through a contradiction that is standing in the way of becoming fully actualized. So when we're thinking of the way that we're understanding human work, we're understanding that human work as a way that a conscious being in and of itself wishes to be self-actualized in terms of becoming recognized by other people. So, in other words, for Hegel, to be recognized by another consciousness is a way to work through and toward self-consciousness. Self-consciousness is self-actualization, self-realization, and likewise a way that we understand human freedom as individuals, and likewise as those individuals are working within a community to become self-conscious. So the way that we get to be freer people is by way of recognizing consciousness as it's understood in terms of work and as a way of combating the essential negative. So the essential negative of death is the way that consciousness is threatened by its annihilation, it's threatened by its dismemberment, it's threatened by its end. That threat of ending consciousness is what gets consciousness to do work to become self-actualized as a way of understanding freedom, okay? So, like I say, this works on an individual level and likewise on a community level. So we might understand, say, the Black Lives Matter protests as emblematic of this, because there's an essential contradiction in terms of the way that black people are dying in the hands of white police officers. And so that death is a way in which people are recognizing that they are not being fully recognized by everyone, okay? And so not being fully recognized is a way that we are understanding self-consciousness as being contradicted, and that's one of the ways in which we work to transcend that by way of something like a Black Lives Matter protest, which is a way of understanding human freedom, okay? So in other words, the way that human consciousness is going to be self-actualized by way of self-consciousness is by working toward freedom. And that freedom must be self-actualized in terms of the other recognizing the individual as self-consciousness, okay? Until that happens, we don't have full human freedom, okay? So there's that progression of freedom through history as a way of understanding our mortality, likewise understanding consciousness, likewise understanding the way in which we as an individual, the way we as individuals work through the very threat of mortality by way of pushing ourselves forward as a desire to be recognized as self-actualized by other people, right? To be recognized and self-actualized by other people is a way of working against death by way of just sheer labor and by way of actualizing human freedom. Okay, so I think that's the best way of characterizing how it is that we're understanding this threat of the negative. So the threat of the negative is something that is essential. So in other words, as far as the dialectic is understood, it is essential to have the negative in order for self-consciousness to progress into self-actualized freedom. Okay? So I think that's helpful to understand G.W.F. Hegel's view of mortality and death, and the negative as essential to the way we understand self-consciousness and self-realization and human freedom. So thanks.